He told her he was stuck in a board meeting that wouldn't end. He said it in the calm, measured voice she had trusted for 11 years. The voice that closed 8-figure deals and made his wife believe every excuse he had ever given her. He said it while standing 40 feet below her, on the patio of the Whistler chalet, his arm around another woman's waist, both of them laughing at something his sister had just said. His wife was watching from the upstairs window of the lodge, a glass of wine going warm in her hand. She could see the back of his head, the navy quarter zip she had bought him for Christmas, the red head leaning into his shoulder like she belonged there. She could see his mother on the deck below, pouring champagne into 4 glasses, not 3, not 5, 4. She could see his brother taking a photo of the whole group with the mountains behind them. The entire Whitcomb family was up at the chalet for the long weekend, every single one of them. Except the woman who had paid for half that chalet, without anyone in that family knowing her name was on the deed. That woman was Adeline Marchetti, and Adeline Marchetti was not who any of them believed her to be. She had grown up in Montreal in a house where money was never discussed at the dinner table, not because there wasn't any, but because her grandfather, Salvatore Marchetti, had built a shipping and logistics empire out of 2 boats and a stubborn refusal to lose, and the family rule, handed down like scripture, was that you never let people see the size of the boat until you knew whether they were trying to sink it or sail it with you. Her father had taken that empire and doubled it, expanding into freight terminals along the St. Lawrence and a quiet but enormous stake in commercial real estate from Halifax to Vancouver. By the time Adeline turned 20, her personal trust, held separately from the family company and managed by a discreet firm in Toronto, generated more in a single quarter than most people made in a decade. Nobody outside the family knew this. That had always been by design. Adeline had watched what money did to people who weren't prepared for it. Her aunt's second marriage had collapsed in 18 months. Once her uncle realized exactly how large the Marchetti name was. A childhood friend had stopped returning her calls, the year Adeline quietly covered the deposit on a downtown condo, and watched the friendship curdle into something transactional and ugly. By 23, Adeline had made a decision that would shape the next decade of her life. She would live like an ordinary woman. She would rent a modest 1-bedroom in the annex, drive a used Honda, clip the odd coupon, not out of necessity, but out of discipline, and she would find out, once and for all, whether a man could love her without knowing what she was worth on paper. She took a job as a project coordinator at a mid-sized engineering firm in Toronto. Decent salary, nothing that would raise eyebrows. She told no one about the trust, not even the women she called her closest friends. She met Ryan Whitcomb. No, that wasn't right. She'd think of him only as Ryan in her own head for the rest of her life, never as anything softer. At a charity gala she'd attended for the open bar and the silent auction, not for networking. He was a corporate lawyer, 2 years into making partner, with a square jaw, an easy laugh, and the particular confidence of a man who had never once in his life had to wonder if a room liked him. He talked about himself the way other people talk about the weather, constantly and without strain. Adeline watched him from across the cocktail table. She wasn't dazzled. She was assessing, the way she assessed everyone, sorting the real from the performed. He wasn't extraordinary, but he was kind that night, in small specific ways. When an elderly board member dropped her clutch, he was the one who bent to pick it up before anyone else noticed it had fallen. When the conversation drifted toward office politics, he talked about a junior associate he was mentoring instead of about himself. When he walked Adeline to her car, he asked what she thought of the book sitting in her tote bag, and then he actually listened to the answer, the whole answer, without checking his phone once. That was what got her, not the jaw, the listening. They dated for 14 months. She watched how he tipped servers, how he spoke to his assistant on the phone, how he handled the one time her ordinary used Honda broke down on the Gardiner, and he came to get her himself instead of sending an Uber. He passed every test she quietly ran, not perfectly, but honestly enough that she let herself believe. They married when she was 26. Small wedding at a vineyard in Niagara-on-the-Lake. Adeline planned every detail down to the napkin folds. Ryan's contribution was showing up freshly shaved and smiling for the photographer. She noticed that. She filed it away and decided, the way she decided most uncomfortable things in those years, not to examine it too closely. The first 6 years of the marriage followed a pattern Adeline recognized with the same clinical precision her father brought to a balance sheet. She managed everything. She paid the mortgage on their Leaside house from her modest salary. even though she could have wired the full amount from the trust without blinking. Because the point was never the money. The point was the test. She handled the insurance renewals, the furnace inspections, the dentist appointments, the in-laws' birthdays. The Christmas cards signed with both their names. She tracked Ryan's CPD hours for the Law Society, because he never remembered the deadline himself. She remembered the names of his partner's spouses and sent flowers when their parents passed. When their daughter, Margot, was born in year 3, Adeline took 10 weeks and came back to a household running exactly as it had before, because she had set it up that way, like a machine that didn't need her standing over it every second. When their son Felix came 2 years after that, she took 12 weeks, and during that stretch she discovered that Ryan still did not know which pediatrician's office to call if either child spiked a fever after hours. She documented everything. Not because she was planning anything. Out of instinct, the same instinct that made her father keep a file on every handshake. She kept records of every bill she paid alone, every appointment she scheduled, every small invisible thread she held, so the household didn't unravel. The trust grew quietly in the background, reviewed at midnight on her laptop after the kids were finally asleep, and Ryan, who believed his wife brought home $61,000 a year and budgeted carefully because she had to, never once wondered why. She never once seemed stressed about money. His mother, Patricia, that wasn't the name either. In Adeline's private accounting, she would only ever call her his mother, refusing to let the word soften into anything like family. Was the kind of woman who could compliment you and wound you in the same breath. You keep such a tidy house, dear. I always say it makes up for a lot. The unspoken second half of that sentence hung in the air every single time. Makes up for the fact that you weren't who I wanted for my son. She was added to the family group chat only after she'd asked twice, and even then she was never once tagged when plans were made. A birthday dinner for his mother that Adeline found out about the night before, from a stray comment. A Thanksgiving call that happened while Adeline was upstairs running a bath for the kids. We were just discussing family things, his mother would say, smiling, when Adeline walked into a room that went suddenly quiet. Ryan's younger sister called her Mrs. Perfect, with a smirk that was never quite a joke, and never quite warm either. Dropping her coat onto the chair Adeline had just straightened, saying, "I genuinely don't know how you keep it all together," as if it were a compliment and not a confession, that she had never once tried to help. Adeline raised it with Ryan exactly once. "I feel shut out of decisions that affect our whole family, and it's been happening for years." Ryan looked at her with an expression she'd cataloged long before that conversation. The look of a man being handed a problem he had no intention of solving. "You're being too sensitive, Addie. That's just how they are." She never raised it again. The cabinet in her chest where she filed these things grew heavier, and her silence was mistaken by every single person in that family for acceptance, when it was actually arithmetic. She had been in Calgary for 9 days for a logistics certification course, the kind of dull, necessary professional development that came with hotel breakfasts and conference badges, and the strange guilty relief of a life where nobody needed anything from her for 9 straight days. She called Ryan every evening. He answered most of the time, sounding normal, mentioning the kids, saying his mother had come to help out. On the last night, she confirmed her flight. "Land at 4:10. I'll grab a cab if you're tied up." He told her not to be ridiculous, that he'd be at the gate himself, that Margot had been counting down the days on the calendar in the kitchen. Her flight landed 12 minutes early. She texted him from the gate. Nothing. She called from baggage claim. Voicemail. She called again, standing outside the arrival's doors with her suitcase handle cold in her palm, and he finally picked up on the 6th ring. "Baby, I am so sorry. I got pulled into a closing. The deal blew up at the last second. You would not believe the day I've had. Grab a cab, I'll make it up to you. I promise." His voice was smooth, rehearsed, not the voice of a man who'd had a hard day. The voice of a man reading from a script he'd used before. Adeline stood very still and listened to the sound behind his voice instead of the words in front of it. No boardroom hum, no printer, no assistant calling his name. Just the low murmur of a large open space, and somewhere behind it, the distant, unmistakable chime of a chairlift bell. He was at the mountain, the family chalet at Whistler. She said, "Okay," and hung up, and did not call back. She took the connector flight she'd booked weeks earlier without telling him. The one for a work thing. She'd never bothered to explain because he'd never bothered to ask. And 3 hours later, she was standing in the upstairs hallway of the chalet, her own family's holding company quietly half-owned, looking down through the great window onto the patio below, where Ryan Whitcomb stood with his arm around a redhead in a cream sweater, laughing at something his mother had said. 4 champagne glasses sweating in the late afternoon light. She watched for 5 full minutes. She watched him tuck a strand of the woman's hair behind her ear. She watched his mother raise a glass and a toast. Adeline wasn't there for. She watched his sister snap a photo of the whole group with the mountains behind them. A photo that would, Adeline understood with total clarity, never have room in it for her. She did not cry. She did not shake. Something moved behind her eyes that was not grief and was not rage. It was older than both of those things. It was the exact sensation of a woman who has spent years making herself smaller, finally remembering the full size of the room she actually owns. She took out her phone. She did not photograph anything. She scrolled to a contact she hadn't called in 3 years. "Desmond," she said when he picked up. "It's Adeline. I need the discretionary account activated. Full authority. And I need the Marchetti Capital team in a room by Tuesday morning." Desmond Okafor had been counsel to the Marchetti family interest for 19 years. He did not ask why. He never did. "Of course, Adeline. Good to have you back." Ryan came home 6 days later, tanned, loose-shouldered, smelling faintly of mountain air, and the particular ease of a man who believed he'd gotten away with something. He found her at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a single closed folder, sitting the way a woman sits when she has already won an argument that hasn't started yet. "There you are," he said, opening the fridge for a beer. "How was the certification thing?" "Informative," she said. "How was the closing?" "Brutal week. 3 deals back to back. I'm exhausted." "Which deals?" He paused, bottle halfway to his mouth. "What? You always tell me which deals. You track your billables religiously. Which 3? A beat of silence that ran 1 second too long. "I don't remember off the top of my head. Thursday, I think. Maybe Friday." She opened the folder. Inside was 1 page. A guest manifest from a private chalet management company, the kind of document that becomes very easy to obtain when your family's holding company technically owns a stake in the building. Ryan Whitcomb, 4 nights Whistler. 1 guest registered alongside him under a name that was not his wife's. She slid it across the table. "I was in the upstairs hallway," she said, her voice even controlled. The same careful tone she had spent 11 years using to manage his moods now repurposed for something else entirely. "I watched you on the patio. I watched your mother pour 4 glasses of champagne. I watched your sister take a photo none of you thought I'd ever see. Adeline, I can explain. You can't. But I can." She pulled out a 2nd page, then a 3rd. Credit card statements for a hotel in Niagara Falls. On a weekend, he'd claimed to be at a CLE seminar. A jewelry charge for $1,100, dated 2 weeks before her own birthday, the birthday on which she had received a card and nothing else. "This has been going on for at least a year," she said. "The paper trail is very clean, Ryan. You were never a careful man. You were just married to a woman careful enough for both of us." His hands were shaking around the bottle. It was a mistake. A stupid, terrible mistake. A year of mistakes isn't a mistake. It's a second life. She closed the folder. She let him see her. Finally, without the mask she'd worn for 11 years. Not the quiet wife. Not the efficient manager of everyone else's existence. But the woman underneath. The one who had been running calculations since the second she stood at that window. "I want a divorce," she said. "Papers will be filed Monday. You can take the guest room until then. Adeline, we have 2 kids. We can work through this. We have 2 kids. That's the only reason this is happening at a kitchen table instead of through lawyers." She stood, picked up the folder, walked toward the stairs. Behind her, his voice cracked open, pleading, promising to end it that night, to call the woman right then and there. She stopped at the doorway without turning around. "You should know something before you start planning your next move, Ryan. I'm not the woman you think you married. I never have been." She went upstairs. She closed the door. She sat on the edge of the bed, breathed for 30 seconds with her eyes shut, then opened her laptop and sent 3 emails. To Desmond, to her personal account manager, to a real estate acquisitions contact she hadn't needed in years. The divorce filing landed on Ryan like something he hadn't seen coming, because he'd never once looked at the tracks. Underneath the legal motion, Adeline was doing what Marchettis had always done. She was restructuring. The down payment on their Leaside house had come. On paper, Ryan had signed, without reading closely a decade earlier, from a personal account funded by trust income. Her lawyers filed a motion establishing her disproportionate contribution to the property, and it landed on his lawyer's desk like a brick through glass. Then there was the firm. Adeline didn't attack Ryan's career directly. She did something quieter. Through the Marchetti Family Foundation, dormant for the length of her marriage, she made a substantial donation to the legal aid clinic affiliated with his law school, with a single condition attached. The new wing would carry the Marchetti name. The dean held a press event. Local business press covered it. Ryan stood in the hallway of his own alma mater weeks later for a partners' retreat and stared at the brass letters on the wall and felt, for the first time in his marriage, genuinely small. His colleagues started asking, "Marchetti, like the shipping Marchettis? Is that your wife's family?" He had no answer, because he had never once asked. The real move was quieter still. Ryan's firm had spent 2 years chasing a development partnership tied to a waterfront parcel near the port. The land was held by a numbered holding company. The holding company belonged, 3 layers down, to a trust managed by Desmond Okafor. Adeline didn't block the deal. She simply let the emails go unanswered. The acquisition stalled. Ryan's partners grew restless and began to fracture around him. And he never once knew the immovable obstacle in his path was the woman he'd married. Sitting on a balcony 6 miles away, choosing not to reply. Within weeks of her leaving, the Leaside house came apart at the seams the way a body does when you remove its spine. The internet went down because the account was in her name. The mortgage payment bounced because Ryan didn't know the login. The furnace filter went unchanged. The lawn went wild. Margot's dentist appointment was missed. The home insurance lapsed without anyone noticing until a pipe burst in February. And there was nothing to cover it. His mother came to help and lasted 9 days before calling his sister in a voice his sister later described as rattled. She was running absolutely everything. I had no idea. His sister said something about Adeline always being a bit of a control freak, and his mother, for the first time in 11 years, said quietly, "No. She was the only competent person in this family, and we treated her like staff." It was the truest thing his mother had ever said about her, and it came far too late, to the wrong person, and changed absolutely nothing. The redhead, whose name was Vanessa, lasted 4 months. She had fallen for the version of Ryan that Adeline had spent a decade building. The lawyer with the spotless house, the organized finances, the calendar that never collided with itself. When the real Ryan emerged, the one who burned grilled cheese and missed parent-teacher interviews and let bills pile unopened on the counter, Vanessa looked at the wreckage and understood, with a clarity that must have stung, that she had fallen in love with another woman's engineering, and the engineer had left the building. Adeline bought a townhouse in Toronto's West End, 3 weeks after filing, in cash, through the trust. 4 bedrooms, a small garden Felix immediately claimed as his own, a rooftop deck, with a view she'd actually chosen for herself for the first time in her adult life. She went back to work, not at the engineering firm, but onto the board of the Marchetti Family Foundation, running a philanthropic portfolio with a budget the size of a small company, using the exact operational instincts she'd spent 11 years pouring into a household that had never once thanked her for it. She was unsurprisingly exceptional at it. A business profile ran in the fall, a single paragraph on the divorce, and 3 full pages on her work funding shelters and education grants across the province. Ryan read it twice. Sitting in the kitchen of a house he could no longer keep clean, surrounded by mail he hadn't opened. And what struck him wasn't the clothes or the new house. It was the scale of what he'd never once asked about in 11 years of marriage. He called on a Sunday evening in November. She let it ring 4 times before answering, sitting on her own rooftop with the city laid out below her like something she finally understood. She'd always owned a piece of Adeline. "I need to see you. Not lawyers, just us. There's nothing to discuss in person. I know about the trust now. I know who your family actually is." "You know now," she said, "because you finally Googled my last name. You didn't know for 11 years because you never asked. You never asked how the mortgage got paid. You never asked why a woman on $61,000 a year never once flinched at a bill. You weren't curious about me. You were comfortable with what I provided. That isn't fair. It's exactly fair. You had 11 years to be curious about your own wife, and instead you spent them letting your mother shut me out, and your sister mock me to my face, and you let another woman into a bed I made every single morning. And now you're calling because you finally understand what name is attached to the bank account." His mother, he said, wanted to apologize. "Your mother wants access," Adeline said. "Those aren't the same thing." His sister wanted an introduction to someone on the foundation board, was hoping to start something of her own. Adeline almost smiled, the kind that lives entirely behind the eyes and never reaches the mouth. "Tell her the contact page is on our website. She's welcome to apply like everyone else." "Adeline, please. I'm losing the house. The waterfront deal is dead. My partner's pulled out, and the holding company won't even return a call. She let the silence stretch 5 full seconds before she answered. The holding company isn't returning your calls, Ryan, because the holding company is me. That parcel has been in my family's portfolio for 14 years. You have spent 2 years trying to buy land from your own wife, and you never knew, because you never once in 11 years asked who I actually was. She heard his breathing go uneven on the other end of the line. I'm not going to sell it to you. I'm also not going to block it forever. It'll go to a qualified buyer at fair market value, and if your group can restructure to meet the terms, you're welcome to bid like anyone else. No discount, no phone call ahead of time. She let one more beat pass. You let your sister call me Mrs. Perfect, like it was a joke. You let your mother tell me a tidy house made up for not being good enough. You called me sensitive every time. I asked to simply be included in my own family. You walked on a floor for 11 years, and never once looked down to see who was holding it up. I hid what I had because I wanted to be loved for exactly who I was, with nothing extra attached. What I found out instead was that I wasn't loved at all. That's the answer to the question you never thought to ask. She ended the call, set the phone face down on the table, and finished her coffee looking at a skyline. She had quietly held pieces of her entire adult life. The same skyline her husband had spent a decade trying to build a career inside of, without ever once realizing whose ground he was standing on. A year after the chalet, on a cold Tuesday night in December, she sat on that same rooftop, wrapped in a blanket she'd bought herself the week she moved in, the first expensive thing she had ever purchased openly, without disguising it as a sale find, without a flicker of guilt. She opened her phone, scrolled to a folder she'd created the night of the chalet. Not photographs, documents, the entire architecture of evidence she had built, with the same precision her father had brought to every handshake of his life. The divorce was final. Custody was settled. The house was sold. The waterfront parcel had gone to a buyer who was not her ex-husband. The foundation was thriving. Her children were safe and growing and learning, simply by watching her, what it looked like when a woman built a life with her own 2 hands and put her own name on it. She selected the folder. She pressed delete. The phone asked her to confirm, and she confirmed, and the folder vanished, and her camera roll filled back in with what was actually left. Margot on the garden swing, Felix covered in finger paint and grinning at the camera, the dog asleep in a patch of late sun on the hardwood, a selfie with her brother at a foundation gala, both of them laughing at nothing in particular. Brass letters on a wall catching the morning light through a set of glass doors. She closed the phone. She thought about the chalet, not the betrayal itself, but the moment she'd stood at that upstairs window and watched her entire marriage laid out beneath her like a blueprint. Instead of breaking, instead of pressing her forehead to the glass and shattering quietly where no one would see, she had picked up the phone and called Desmond and stepped back into the life she had spent a decade pretending she didn't need. It hadn't been revenge. It had been recognition. The recognition that the woman she'd been pretending to be was smaller than the woman she actually was, and that the pretending had never once protected her. It had only made her invisible to the people she had been trying so hard to love. She wasn't invisible now. Her name was on a wall. Her money moved markets she'd never bothered telling her husband she understood. Her children slept safely under a roof she owned outright. Her garden was growing. Her foundation was funding shelters for women who had been made to feel small by men who needed them to stay that size. She had tested love against anonymity and learned, finally and completely, that love without curiosity isn't love at all. It's just consumption. The wind moved through the rosemary on the railing. The city hung below her, lit up and indifferent, and entirely hers in places no one walking through it would ever guess. Somewhere above the skyline, a plane crossed west, lights blinking against the dark, carrying someone somewhere, who might or might not be lying to a person on the other end of a phone call. Adeline watched it pass, pulled the blanket tighter, and breathed in the cold and the rosemary, and the particular silence of a woman who no longer had any reason to pretend to be smaller than she was.